Her bed still warm, a candle still burning, yet no one remains. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me where you're watching from. Your voices bring this mystery alive. Now let's begin. The rain had not stopped since morning. A fine drizzle that blurred the outlines of the street lamps and dampened the stone facades of Boulevard Richard-Lenoir. Maigret sat by the window of his office, his heavy frame sunk into the worn leather chair, watching the trickle of water chase itself down the glass. His pipe lay cooling in the ashtray, forgotten. He was not waiting for anything in particular. The day was one of those that seemed to stretch without urgency, punctuated only by the muffled clatter of typewriters from the squad room and the occasional cough of a clerk. He thought about Madame Maigret, who would by now be preparing a slow stew in their kitchen at Boulevard Richard-Lenoir. She disliked days like this, when the damp crept into the bones of the old building, and she would scold him later for coming home with his coat smelling of tobacco and rain. He smiled faintly at the thought. It was a private smile, one no one at the Quai des Orfèvres would ever notice. The telephone rang, not abruptly, but with the soft insistence of routine. He reached for it, his large hand moving slowly, and lifted the receiver without hurry. Her voice, one of the young inspectors, too brisk for the hour, reported an incident in the Rue des Trois Frères. Not officially a murder, not yet. The words used were a discovery, a disturbance, the kind of call that might lead nowhere at all, or to a case that would linger in the mind for years. Maigret did not ask questions immediately. He let the voice run on, describing how the concierge had insisted on the police coming, how there had been talk of a candle burning too long in a room where no one answered the door. Only when the inspector's account ran dry did Maigret grunt softly, a sound of agreement more than curiosity. He rose slowly, heavy in his overcoat, and reached for the hat on the rack. Outside the rain had thickened, not quite a storm but steady, purposeful, soaking his shoulders as he stepped into the car. He gave the address to the driver without impatience, leaning back as the city slid by, grey rooftops glistening, children tugged along under umbrellas, the occasional café glowing faintly, promising warmth and wine to those with time to stop. At Rue des Trois Frères, the car halted. The street was narrow, the cobbles wet and uneven, shining under the lamps. A handful of neighbors had gathered by the doorway, their faces pinched with curiosity, and the faint satisfaction of being present when something unusual disturbed the monotony of their lives. Maigret did not push them aside, nor did he bark at them to move. His presence alone seemed to part them, his silence heavier than words. The concierge, a small woman with wisps of hair escaping her scarf, wrung her hands as she led him in. She whispered as though in church, explaining that she had smelled wax and smoke, that she had knocked and knocked, that she feared something was wrong. Maigret listened without comment, his large coat brushing the narrow walls as he climbed the stairs. On the third floor the door stood ajar. Inside the room was dim. A bed, its sheets unmade, held a single candle, half burned, its wax hardened into rivulets along the candlestick. It still burned faintly, a small flame bending with each draught from the open door. On the chair beside it, a man's coat lay discarded, damp from the rain, though the window was closed. There was no body. Not yet. Only the quiet strangeness of a bed still warm, a candle burning past its purpose, and the air of a life interrupted in mid-step. Maigret stood in the doorway, saying nothing. He let the silence settle around him, let the others shuffle nervously behind. He filled his pipe, struck a match, and watched the flame flare before he drew it out. The candle on the bedside table flickered in response, as though acknowledging him. It was not a crime scene yet, not officially. But Maigret already felt the heaviness in the air, the subtle unease that told him he was no longer in an ordinary room. Something had been left unfinished here. He would wait. He would watch. And eventually someone would speak. The candle flame bent again as Maigret moved further into the room, his broad shadow spilling across the walls. He had not spoken since arriving, but that silence was eloquent enough. The concierge lingered in the doorway, half afraid to step closer, half drawn by her need to explain herself. Maigret let her breathe in the air of the room as he did, listening without words. A faint odor lingered. Wax, of course, but something else not unpleasant. Perhaps the residue of cheap cologne, or the ghost of cigarette smoke that clung to fabrics after too many nights of routine. The window, he noticed, was firmly shut. The curtains were pulled halfway, the kind of gesture made by someone expecting privacy, but not concealment. On the table near the bed, beside the candle, a pair of spectacles rested atop a folded newspaper. The date was yesterday's. A saucer, its edges stained with coffee, suggested the last moments had not been hurried but unremarkable, part of an ordinary routine. What had disturbed it was not visible. No overturned chair, no broken glass, no sign of panic. Yet there was the unmistakable sense of interruption, of someone called away by something they had not anticipated. The concierge began again, her voice low and nasal. She said she had come up earlier in the afternoon, when the candle smell reached her through the stairwell. She had knocked several times, but no answer came. She had returned later, with the same result. That last, worried about fire, she fetched her passkey and opened the door, only to find the bed still warm, though no one was inside. The candle had been burning since then, she insisted, and she had not touched anything, not even the coat left on the chair. Her words tumbled over each other in a rush to excuse her intrusion, but Maigret only nodded, his heavy eyelids drooping slightly, his pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling. Behind her, in the hallway, the inspector who had called him shifted impatiently. He was young, eager, more comfortable with clear facts than with the uncertainty of a room still filled with someone's unseen presence. Maigret let him fidget, knowing that the impatience of others often worked in his favor. People grew uncomfortable in silence. They filled it with words they had not intended to speak. He asked at last, almost lazily, whether the tenant was known to her. The concierge pressed her hands together. Yes, she said. The man had been here for several weeks, perhaps a month. She was not certain of the day he had arrived. He had paid regularly in cash, and had given his name as Monsieur Mercier, though she did not know if it was his true name. He was polite, quiet, never caused trouble. Alone? Always alone, except for one evening when someone had visited, a younger man she had not recognized. They had spoken in low voices, and afterward Mercier had seemed preoccupied, less cordial than usual. That was all she could tell him. Maigret let the detail rest in the air, not pursuing it, not asking for description. Instead, he looked once more at the coat on the chair. It was a heavy overcoat, damp at the hem as though worn recently in the rain. Yet the man was not here, and no umbrella lay beside it. A curious omission. If one went out on a night like this, one did not leave behind both coat and umbrella. The contradiction was small, but it pricked at him. He asked to see the neighbors. The concierge, relieved to leave the strange room, led him back down the narrow stairwell. On the landing below, a door opened cautiously, and a woman in a dressing gown peered out. She was in her 40s, her hair pinned too neatly for the late hour, her eyes sharp with curiosity. Maigret stopped, turning toward her without speaking. She offered, without being asked, that she had not heard a sound from above, nothing unusual, except perhaps footsteps late last night, though that was common in such buildings. She hesitated, then added that Monsieur Mercier had seemed troubled recently. He had stood smoking at the window more than once, staring down into the street with an expression she could not read. Maigret thanked her with a slight inclination of his head, nothing more. Already she seemed to regret saying as much, pulling her dressing gown tighter, retreating into her apartment. The door clicked softly shut. He and the concierge continued downward, each step echoing. On the ground floor, several tenants had gathered by the entrance, murmuring among themselves. The concierge introduced them hastily, but Maigret scarcely listened. He watched them instead, their shifting eyes, their eagerness to be seen cooperating, the small signs of fear that something irregular in their building might reflect on them. He asked only one question, to no one in particular. Had anyone seen Monsieur Mercier today? A murmur passed among them, uncertain. One thought she had seen him in the morning, leaving with a briefcase. Another was sure he had not returned since the previous night. A third recalled hearing footsteps on the stairs at an hour too late for decency, though she could not say whether they were his. The contradictions overlapped, small details clashing like weak shadows on the wall. Maigret did not challenge them. He merely allowed the fragments to hang, to knot themselves. Outside, the drizzle had not ceased. The street lamps gave off their damp glow, and the crowd of neighbors dispersed slowly, their curiosity satisfied for now. Maigret remained in the doorway, his broad silhouette framed against the night. He lit his pipe again, drawing the smoke deeply, and let the rhythm of the rain guide his thoughts. There was no urgency, no cry for haste. Something was wrong, but wrong in a quiet way, wrong in the manner of a life misaligned rather than violently broken. He could feel it, as one feels the pressure of weather changing before the storm arrives. The inspector asked whether they should search the city for Mercier, whether an alert should be issued. Maigret shook his head. Not yet. The man would return or he would not, but chasing phantoms in the wet streets would bring nothing. Better to wait, to watch, to let the shape of the absence become clearer. He suggested instead that the concierge remain attentive, that she notice who might come asking after Mercier, that she not touch the room again until instructed. She nodded vigorously, her relief evident, as though the burden had shifted back to him. As he walked toward the corner café, Maigret felt the weariness of the day settling into his shoulders. The café was nearly empty, only 2 men playing dominoes at the back and the patron polishing glasses behind the counter. He ordered a beer, not hurriedly, not as if parched, but as part of the natural order of such evenings. The glass was cool, the foam thick, and he let it rest on the table before taking a slow drink. From where he sat, he could still see the doorway of the building across the street. The candle would still be burning in that room, its flame dwindling as the wax consumed itself. It was not yet a case, not officially, but already it belonged to him. He knew he would not sleep until he understood why a man had left his coat behind, why a bed had been left warm and unoccupied, why a candle had been allowed to burn without witness. The drizzle thickened to rain. People passed with umbrellas tilted low, their faces hidden. Somewhere in the city, Monsieur Mercier walked or did not walk, existed or had ceased to exist. Maigret waited, beer in hand, his presence as patient as the night itself. He had no need to hurry. Time would deliver what it always did. The small human details that betrayed more than questions ever could. The candle's flame, he imagined, still wavered against the darkness, marking the hour when something had quietly gone wrong. It was enough to hold him there, watching, waiting. A silent figure at the window of the café, as the city breathed around him and the rain refused to stop. The café's glass panes fogged lightly as the heat from within met the damp chill outside. Maigret sat unmoving, the beer glass between his hands, his pipe smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. The candle in the room across the street was no longer visible from here, hidden by curtains and stone, yet its flame lingered in his mind as if it burned behind his own eyes. The night pressed close, filled with the rhythm of footsteps on cobblestones and the hiss of wheels gliding through rainwater. The patron behind the counter looked up once or twice at him, curious but not intrusive. Maigret was a familiar enough figure, even in places he had not visited before. His bulk, his heavy overcoat, the manner in which he filled a chair without ceremony, made him seem as if he had always belonged there. After a while the patron ventured to remark that the weather was set to continue all week. Maigret nodded, offering no opinion. The small talk served its purpose. It drew the man closer, loosened him, made him eager to speak again. When Maigret asked, in a tone scarcely more than a murmur, whether the man knew the tenants across the street, the words slipped out naturally. Yes, of course, the patron said. He saw them often enough. Most of them were ordinary, people who came and went without notice. One man in particular, quiet, well-dressed, not extravagant but precise, would sometimes cross for a drink in the early evening, though never staying long. Always alone. He drank a single glass of wine, read his paper, then returned. Maigret let the description settle, only nodding again as if it confirmed something rather than opened a question. A younger inspector, still restless, entered the café, shaking the water from his hat. He approached Maigret with the energy of one expecting instruction. They had sent word to the station, he explained, and would have Mercier's details checked against records. If the name was false, something might yet emerge. Maigret responded only with a low sound, neither agreement nor refusal, and gestured for the inspector to sit. The younger man fidgeted, his coat dripping, his eyes darting toward the counter. He ordered coffee, too quickly, betraying nerves. Maigret studied him in silence, not to unnerve but because silence was his natural state. After a few moments the inspector began speaking again, filling the void. He reported that no one had seen Mercier leave the building after the candle was discovered. The neighbors' testimonies contradicted one another, but none had produced certainty. Maigret listened, puffing slowly at his pipe, the rhythm of the young man's voice as revealing as the words. Impatience, eagerness, a desire for clarity. He was too young yet to accept the weight of uncertainty. When the inspector finally asked what should be done next, Maigret finished his beer, set the glass down carefully and stood. They would wait until morning, he said. The city had its own rhythm. By daylight, details would emerge that the night concealed. He left coins on the counter, nodded to the patron and stepped out once more into the wet streets. The ride back to Quai des Orfèvres was unhurried. He leaned into the seat, watching the lamps blur through the rain-streaked window. His thoughts were not of Mercier alone, but of the candle's flame, of the coat left behind, of the silence that weighed heavier than any spoken account. He carried these impressions home as naturally as the damp clinging to his clothes. Madame Maigret was waiting, as he had expected, with the smell of stew thick in the kitchen. She did not scold him, only pressed him to eat, and he did so with slow appreciation. She asked no questions about the case, she never did, but remarked instead that a candle burning too long was bad luck. He looked at her then, more attentively than she realized, storing the words as one more thread to be woven into the quiet fabric of the investigation. That night he slept lightly, the image of the bed and candle revisiting him in fragments. By morning he was already awake, before the drizzle had lifted. The city was grey still, though the clouds seemed thinner, promising a day of damp streets and pale light. At the office, reports awaited him. None too useful. The name Mercier yielded nothing definite, too common to trace easily, too nondescript to anchor itself to a history. The younger inspector urged pursuing other leads, but Maigret brushed the suggestion aside for now. He wanted to see the street in daylight, to observe what the rain and night had blurred. By late morning he was back at Rue des Trois Frères. The building looked different in pale daylight, less mysterious, more shabby, with its cracked plaster and narrow windows. Children played near the entrance, their laughter untroubled by the night's unease. Maigret paused to watch them, noting how the tenants glanced down occasionally, their curiosity still alive. The concierge was waiting at her post, expectant, nervous. She ushered him up once more to the third floor, where the candle had burned itself down to a stub. The wax had cooled, leaving hardened rivulets across the table. The coat was still there, the spectacles, the newspaper folded neatly. The air had grown stale overnight, carrying a faint, sour note that came not from death but from absence. He sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking under his weight. He touched the newspaper, then the spectacles, then simply sat with his pipe unlit between his teeth. The silence deepened until the concierge shifted uneasily, whispering that no one had come or gone since the evening before. He did not answer her. His mind lingered on the contradictions: a man who left without his coat in the rain, a candle that burned past sleep, a neighbor who claimed footsteps at an unusual hour. He asked to see the register. She produced it reluctantly, a worn book of names and dates. Mercier had signed in on a Tuesday 3 weeks prior, with handwriting precise but unremarkable. No profession listed, only the name and a vague note. Commercial. He had paid each week promptly, cash folded neatly into an envelope. No luggage of note, only a single suitcase when he arrived. Maigret examined the handwriting, his eyes narrowing slightly, not because he recognized it, but because it told him nothing. Deliberately so, perhaps. He descended again, this time stopping at each floor. He spoke briefly to the woman in the dressing gown, who seemed more cautious now. She repeated what she had said, though with slight differences. Perhaps it had been 2 nights ago that she heard footsteps, not last night. She could not be certain. The story shifted ever so slightly, betraying not deceit but the vagueness of memory clouded by curiosity. On the second floor, a man in shirt-sleeves leaned in his doorway, grumbling about the disturbance. He had known Mercier by sight, nothing more. He thought the man worked in insurance or something similar, always carrying papers, always precise. Yet he had never spoken to him beyond a polite greeting. His wife, appearing behind him, added that Mercier sometimes hummed to himself when returning late at night, a habit that struck her as peculiar in a man otherwise so quiet. Maigret stored these fragments without reaction. Back on the street, the daylight revealed other details. The tobacconist at the corner remembered Mercier buying cigarettes, Gauloises, every few days. Always the same packet, always paid without small talk. The baker across the way said he had never once bought bread there, though he passed daily. A detail small but telling. People who lived in a place left traces. Mercier seemed to avoid them, skimming along the surface of daily life without anchoring himself. By early afternoon, Maigret returned to the café where he had sat the previous night. The patron greeted him with recognition, setting a glass before him without asking. Maigret sipped slowly, scanning the street as the drizzle began again, lighter this time, almost delicate. He could feel the threads gathering. Mercier was not an ordinary lodger. His careful routine, his avoidance of neighbors, his coat left behind, it all suggested a man living temporarily, perhaps under a name not his own, waiting for something that had now arrived. The young inspector returned with news that no missing persons matched Mercier, no alerts from other arrondissements. A dead end, perhaps, but Maigret was not discouraged. He leaned back, pipe smoke curling upward, eyes half closed. Cases were not solved in bursts of revelation. They unraveled like wet cloth, threads loosening until the pattern lay bare. He had begun to feel the first tug. Evening fell again, the lamps flickering on, the street glistening once more. The café grew louder with patrons returning from work, their voices filling the room with the ordinary rhythms of life. Maigret listened without seeming to, his eyes still fixed across the street. He was waiting, as he always did, for the silence to break, for some small detail to emerge, for anyone to falter. It would come. It always did. The drizzle continued into the next morning, finer now, almost mist hanging over the rooftops of Montmartre. Maigret had returned to the Rue des Trois Frères earlier than most would expect, before the tenants had properly begun their day. He liked those hours when people were still unguarded, when their first words carried the residue of dreams rather than the armor of routine. The concierge greeted him with the weary politeness of one who had slept poorly, anxious about what she might yet be asked to recall. She assured him again that no one had returned to the third-floor room, that the coat and spectacles remained just as they were, though she had tiptoed up once or twice to look in. Her curiosity was genuine, but so was her unease. It was not every day a tenant disappeared, leaving behind a candle that burned too long. Maigret climbed the stairs slowly, pausing at each landing, as though the walls themselves might tell him something. He had learned long ago that buildings retained memories, the smell of cooking, the creak of stairwells, the faint drafts where doors had slammed too often. At Mercier's floor he stood for a moment listening. Silence. He entered, his bulk filling the small room once more. The bed was cold now, the candle a hardened stub. He walked to the window, opened it slightly, and let in the pale morning air. The coat still hung on the chair. He touched it with the back of his hand, dry now but heavy with the smell of damp wool. His eyes moved again to the newspaper folded neatly, the spectacles resting on top. There was a faint smudge on the lens, as if a finger had brushed it in haste. He lit his pipe, sat in the chair and stared at the objects. Nothing in them spoke loudly, yet together they insisted on something withheld, something left unresolved. The younger inspector arrived shortly after, brisk as always, carrying a folder of notes. He reported that the name Mercier had not appeared in hotel registers nearby, nor in police files that matched the man's description. If it was an alias, it was a careful one. He suggested widening the search. Maigret listened, puffed his pipe, and shook his head slightly. Widening too soon only dispersed the threads. Better to hold them close until they showed where they led. Downstairs the tenants had begun to stir. A man in a grey suit left hurriedly, nodding at Maigret without stopping. The woman in the dressing gown from the night before appeared again, this time with her hair pinned less neatly, her face pale. She seemed to have been waiting for him. She said, almost whispering, that someone had come to the building very late after midnight. She had heard the steps again, lighter than Mercier's, quicker. She had been too afraid to open her door, but she had listened and she thought she had heard the creak of Mercier's door just once before silence returned. She looked at Maigret as if to be absolved for not having spoken of it earlier. He did not scold her, only nodded, his eyes steady on hers. Outside, the street was stirring. The café was already open, its windows clouded with steam. Maigret crossed over, heavy steps steady on the wet cobblestones. The patron set a glass on the counter before he asked, knowing by now the rhythm of Maigret's presence. From the window he could see the entrance to the building, the door opening and closing as tenants went about their business. He waited, his beer untouched for long minutes. The younger inspector shifted beside him, impatient, asking quietly whether they should check with local shops again, press for more details. Maigret lifted his glass at last, drank slowly and said nothing. It was just past noon when a figure appeared that did not fit. A young man, slender, in a dark overcoat too new for the street, paused at the building's entrance. He looked up once, hesitated, then entered quickly. Maigret did not move at once. He finished his beer, set the glass down with care, then rose, his face unreadable. He crossed the street without hurry, the inspector close at his side, and stepped into the dim stairwell. On the landing, they found the concierge already flustered, speaking too quickly, insisting that the young man had gone upstairs, that he had not given his name. Maigret gestured for silence and began the slow climb. He could hear steps above, quick, nervous, retreating into Mercier's room. When he reached the third floor, the door was open. The young man stood inside, staring at the bed, at the stub of candle, at the coat left behind. He turned at last, his face pale, his eyes darting. He tried to explain at once, words tumbling, that he was a friend, that he had come only to check, that Mercier had spoken of leaving. His voice was too fast, his sentences incomplete. Maigret did not interrupt. He stepped inside, lit his pipe again, and stood near the table. The silence grew heavy. The young man's hands trembled as he pulled off his gloves, then replaced them nervously. He glanced at the inspector, then at Maigret, then back to the bed, as though searching for a clue of what he ought to say. At last Maigret asked, almost gently, how long he had known Mercier. The young man faltered, said it had been some months that they had met through business. What business? He hesitated, muttered something about import, about papers. His words slipped, repeated, contradicted. Maigret let the pauses stretch, watching the way his throat tightened, the way his hands sought the comfort of his gloves. The inspector asked a sharper question, pressing about when he had last seen Mercier. The young man answered too quickly, last night late here. He had come to speak with him, but Mercier had been distracted, restless. He had said little, only that he must leave soon. After that he had gone. The candle had still been burning. He swore this was the truth. Maigret did not argue. He drew on his pipe, the smoke curling slowly. He asked if Mercier had left a message, any sign of where he might go. The young man shook his head, eyes dropping to the floor. His denial was firm, too firm. He insisted he knew nothing more. Then suddenly, as though realizing his own haste, he begged that the matter not be made official. Mercier, he said, had his reasons for privacy. Maigret only grunted, non-committal. He told the inspector to take the young man's name and address, nothing more for now. The man hesitated again, gave a name, André Lemoine, and an address in the 11th arrondissement. The concierge repeated it under her breath, as if memorizing it for herself. Lemoine left soon after, his steps hurried, his coat collar raised against the drizzle. Back in the room, the silence seemed heavier. The bed, the coat, the spectacles remained as they had been, yet the air was different. The candle stub no longer suggested absence alone. It hinted at a departure too sudden, too deliberate. Maigret stood for a long time, his hand resting on the chair back, his pipe gone out again. The inspector asked whether Lemoine should be followed at once. Maigret shook his head. Not yet. It was better to let him believe the matter rested, to see what he would do when not watched. People revealed themselves most clearly when they thought no one cared. That evening, Maigret returned once more to the café. He sat in his usual place, beer before him, watching the doorway across the street. The drizzle turned to rain again, soft, persistent. He waited, as he always did, for the city to give up its secrets. The candle had burned itself out, but its flame lingered in his mind, marking the hour when something had shifted. Lemoine's hurried words, the contradictions in the tenants' memories, the coat left behind, each was a thread. He knew that in time they would weave themselves into a pattern. Until then he would watch and wait, patient as the rain itself. The rain had grown heavier by the time Maigret left the café, pressing down on the lamps and spreading silvery reflections across the cobblestones. He walked slowly, his hat pulled low, his heavy coat drinking in the water. The street was quieter now, fewer people lingering, only hurried figures slipping into doorways. He did not mind the wet. It seemed fitting, as if the city itself wished to wash away the traces of Mercier's absence. At the corner, he hailed a taxi, gave his address and leaned back against the worn seat. The smell of damp upholstery mixed with his pipe tobacco as he drew deeply, not thinking so much as letting thoughts drift. At home, Madame Maigret welcomed him with her usual calm. She had prepared a roast chicken, fragrant and simple, and urged him to change his wet coat before sitting down. He obeyed with the heavy grace of a man accustomed to small rituals. Over dinner, she spoke of errands, of a neighbor's illness, of the laundry she would send out in the morning. He listened, replying only with nods until she mentioned, almost idly, that she disliked it when people left candles burning. It was careless, she said, even reckless, and if the man had gone out without his coat, leaving such a thing behind, then perhaps he had not meant to return at all. Maigret paused, his fork in mid-air. Her words carried no suspicion, only practical disapproval, yet they struck him. He thought of the stub of wax hardened on the table, of the bed still warm that first evening, of the coat heavy with rain left behind. Not meant to return, that was the thread that tugged at him. He made no remark, only grunted softly, but his eyes lingered on the tablecloth as though it held the answer. Later that night, sitting in his armchair with his pipe, he reviewed the fragments again. A man who lived quietly, paying in cash, avoiding neighbors. A younger man visiting once, returning nervously to the empty room, a candle burning longer than reason allowed. The possibility grew in him, not of a sudden disappearance, but of a deliberate act, an arrangement known only to those two. Yet where was the body if there was one? And why leave behind the things that most marked a man as himself, the coat, the spectacles, the newspaper folded with care? The following morning, he returned to the Rue des Trois Frères, this time without announcement. The tenants were beginning their day, hurrying out with umbrellas, stepping around puddles. He lingered in the doorway until the concierge appeared. She asked at once whether they had found Mercier. He shook his head, but asked her whether anyone else had come asking about him. She hesitated, then admitted that a letter had arrived the day before, after the police had first visited. She had not dared open it, but it lay now in the box. He took it in his broad hand, studied the envelope. The handwriting was careful, feminine, the address written with deliberate strokes. No return name, only a Paris postmark. He slipped it into his coat without opening it there. The concierge watched anxiously, as if the letter itself might accuse her of negligence. He told her to carry on as usual, that no more was required of her for now. In the office, he studied the envelope again. He opened it slowly, unfolding the single sheet within. The words were brief, almost curt. "I will be at the usual place Thursday. Do not fail me. No name, no signature." The handwriting was the same as the address, precise, unhurried, suggesting confidence rather than urgency. Thursday had already passed. The meeting had either taken place or been missed. Either way, Mercier had not returned. He showed the letter to the young inspector, who at once suggested tracing the handwriting, checking cafes, searching for women who might have arranged such a meeting. Maigret only grunted. Too many places in Paris, too many cafes where a man and woman might meet. Better to wait, better to let the letter itself work in his favor. He slipped it back into his pocket. That afternoon he called at the address given by André Lemoine. The building was newer, more respectable, with polished stone and brass nameplates. A maid admitted him reluctantly, and soon Lemoine appeared, paler than before, his manner still nervous. He invited Maigret into a small sitting room furnished with care but lacking warmth. Lemoine spoke at once, insisting that he had no idea where Mercier had gone, that his visit to the lodging had been only from concern. He repeated himself, words overlapping as though rehearsed. Maigret let the silence stretch, studying the furnishings, a clock ticking too loudly, a vase of flowers already wilting, books neatly aligned but clearly unread. He asked finally whether Lemoine had known of any woman connected to Mercier. Lemoine's face flushed. He denied it quickly, too quickly, his hands clutching the arm of his chair. He insisted Mercier had been solitary, that he had no acquaintances of that sort. Maigret only puffed at his pipe, his heavy-lidded eyes giving away nothing. When he rose to leave, Lemoine followed him to the door, repeating his denials, urging that he was an honest man, dragged into something he did not understand. Maigret left without comment, his bulk filling the hallway as he descended the stairs. Outside, he stood for a long moment in the drizzle, watching the street. Lemoine's nervousness was too marked, his words too insistent. A man truly innocent would not protest so much. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, he dictated a quiet surveillance order. Lemoine was not to be approached, not to be questioned further, but watched. His comings and goings, his visitors, his letters. Maigret trusted patience more than pressure. People revealed themselves when left alone with their secrets. That evening, over dinner once more, Madame Maigret asked idly whether the missing man had a family. Maigret shrugged. Nothing had yet been found. No claim of kin, no inquiries. She mused aloud that perhaps he had come to Paris to be forgotten, to slip away. Maigret chewed slowly, thinking of the letter, of the woman who expected him at a place unnamed. Forgotten or hiding, it amounted to much the same. Later in his office he sat with the letter spread before him again. He read the words over and over. The usual place. To the woman it was obvious, a place known only to them. To him it was a void, an absence. Yet absences often spoke more loudly than presence. He closed his eyes, leaning back heavily, listening to the patter of rain against the window. Somewhere in the city, perhaps in a small café, perhaps at a rented room, a woman still waited. And somewhere André Lemoine twisted in his chair, wondering what the inspector knew. The day had offered no resolution, only deepened the strangeness. Yet Maigret felt closer, not farther. The threads were pulling tighter, the candle left to burn, the coat abandoned, the nervous young man, the unseen woman with her brief letter. It was not yet a case that could be presented, but it had already entered his bones, as cases did when they bore the weight of human weakness more than crime. He tamped his pipe, struck a match and let the flame flare before it died into smoke. Waiting was as much a tool as questioning. He would wait, and the truth, fragile as a candle flame, would flicker into view. The rain eased into a fine mist that morning, the kind that seemed to hang in the air without falling, softening the outlines of buildings and dulling the clatter of carts on the cobblestones. Maigret arrived at Quai des Orfèvres earlier than usual, his broad frame filling the doorway of his office, pipe clenched between his teeth. He settled into his chair, heavy as ever, and allowed the silence to thicken before reaching for the reports left neatly on his desk. They concerned the surveillance order he had placed on André Lemoine. The men assigned to watch him had been discreet, but their notes already suggested unease. Lemoine had remained indoors for most of the day, venturing out only once in the late afternoon to post a letter at a corner box. His steps were hurried, his manner furtive. He returned without pause at any shop or café, as though intent on avoiding notice. Maigret read slowly, his thick fingers turning the pages without haste. The letter posted was the detail that caught him. It meant there was someone else, someone waiting for word from him, someone still tied to Mercier through threads not yet visible. He set the report aside, filled his pipe again and leaned back in his chair, letting the smoke curl lazily toward the ceiling. He did not summon the inspector immediately, nor dictate orders. He preferred to let such details settle, to test their weight in his own mind, before pressing them into action. By mid-morning he left the office, taking a taxi toward Lemoine's address. He did not enter this time, nor announce himself. He stood across the street in the drizzle, his hat pulled low, watching the entrance. The house was respectable, too respectable for a man whose nerves betrayed him at every turn. A maid opened the door briefly to shake out a rug, then disappeared inside. Lemoine himself did not emerge. Maigret stood for several minutes, invisible by virtue of his stillness, before turning away. He had seen enough. At noon he returned to Rue des Trois Frères, as if the shabby stairwell might have changed in his absence. The concierge greeted him eagerly, almost with relief. She whispered that someone had come asking after Mercier that morning. A woman, middle-aged, with a quiet manner and a scarf pulled tightly around her head. She had asked if Mercier was in, and when told he was not, had simply nodded and walked away. The concierge had not dared question her further, though she had the impression of someone who was not surprised by the answer. Maigret listened without comment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he drew at his pipe. The unseen woman of the letter, perhaps, or another link in the chain. He asked only whether she might recognize the woman again. The concierge nodded, though uncertainly. He left her with a quiet instruction. Should the woman return, she was to be offered no more than the truth, that Mercier had not been seen and nothing else. Back in the cafe across the street, he sat once more with his beer, watching. The street bustled with midday errands, but nothing unusual occurred. He drank slowly, the glass sweating on the table, while the younger inspector shifted restlessly beside him. The man asked whether they should circulate the woman's description, whether they should question shops and neighbors. Maigret exhaled smoke and shook his head. No. To hunt too soon was to scatter shadows. Better to wait, to let the woman reveal herself again. She would. They always did. The afternoon dragged into evening. Lamps flickered on, their glow haloed by mist. The street grew quieter. Maigret returned home at last, his coat heavy with damp. At dinner, Madame Maigret remarked again on the strangeness of a man leaving without his coat, especially in such weather. She wondered aloud whether perhaps someone else had taken it, a thought voiced as if in passing. Maigret did not reply, but the idea lingered. A coat left behind might not have been left by its owner at all. The next morning brought another report on Lemoine. He had gone out after dark, walking quickly, turning corners as if to lose an unseen follower. But the men tailing him had been careful. He had ended up in a small café near the Canal Saint-Martin, where he met a woman. She was older than him, plainly dressed with dark gloves she did not remove. They spoke quietly for nearly an hour. Lemoine gestured often, nervously, while the woman remained composed, listening more than speaking. When they left, they parted at the door, he walking swiftly home, she disappearing into the narrow streets. Maigret folded the report and sat in silence for a long time. He thought of the letter, the usual place. Perhaps that café was it. Perhaps the woman was the same who had come to the concierge. He did not rush to confirm it. Instead, he decided he would go himself. That evening he entered the café near the canal. It was unremarkable, a narrow room with plain tables, the smell of beer and onions in the air. The patron looked up, curious, then indifferent. Maigret ordered a glass of white wine and sat near the back, his hat and coat dripping by his side. He watched the door. The place filled slowly with locals, men finishing work, a pair of women gossiping. No one paid him attention. After half an hour, the door opened again. A woman entered, middle-aged, scarf tied firmly, gloves still on her hands. She glanced around once, then chose a table at the far end. She ordered tea in a low voice. Her movements were deliberate, precise. She did not notice him, or pretended not to. Maigret sipped his wine, eyes heavy-lidded, waiting. She remained for only a short time, her gaze often on the door, as though expecting someone who never arrived. At last she rose, paid, and left. Maigret followed, not closely, but with the steady rhythm of a man who belonged to the night streets. She walked without hurry, her steps firm until she turned into a side street and vanished into the entrance of a modest boarding house. He noted the address, the worn shutters, the faint glow from within. He did not enter. He walked past, pipe smoke curling, his mind settling on the pattern taking shape. Later at his desk, he marked the address in his notebook. Mercier Lemoine, the woman. Threads woven now into something more than coincidence. He did not yet know the shape of it, but he felt its weight. Something had passed between them, something unfinished, and the candle left burning was part of it. He tamped his pipe, struck a match, and leaned back as the rain resumed, steady against the windows. He would wait again. The truth, like smoke, rose best when undisturbed. The mist had thickened into a dull, steady rain by the next morning, flattening the colors of Paris until everything appeared washed in grey. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres later than usual, his hat and coat dripping as he entered the building. The clerks looked up briefly, then returned to their papers, used to his heavy silence. In his office he hung his coat to dry, filled his pipe, and settled behind his desk where the reports from the surveillance men awaited him. Lemoine had left his apartment again the previous evening. He had gone to the same café near the Canal Saint-Martin, though this time alone. He had ordered wine and sat nervously, glancing often at the door. He remained there nearly an hour before leaving in frustration, walking quickly back to his building. The woman had not appeared. The notes from the men were careful, precise, yet what mattered most was not the absence of the woman, but the effect it had on Lemoine. He was unraveling, his composure fraying. Maigret let the pipe smoke drift across the reports before pushing them aside. He did not need the details written out. He could see the scene in his mind as though he had been there. A young man waiting too long, shoulders tight, cigarette burning down to ash while he stared at the door. The patrons around him drinking without notice, the clock ticking. Each passing minute pressing more heavily upon him. Maigret knew that weight, the pressure of silence, of expectation unmet. He had used it often himself. By late morning he was once more in Rue des Trois Frères. The concierge greeted him with her usual nervous eagerness, telling him no one had come again for Mercier. She added, as if confiding, that the tenants whispered among themselves. Some thought Mercier had run off, others that something worse had happened. They spoke of it in the stairwell, in the laundry room. Fear clung to such places like damp. Maigret listened without interruption, his large head inclined slightly, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He climbed to the third floor, entered the silent room, and stood again beside the bed where the candle had once burned. Nothing had changed, yet the space seemed to weigh differently now, heavy with absence. He remained there a long time, pipe unlit between his teeth. He tried to imagine Mercier's last hours. The bed warm, the candle burning, the coat draped on the chair. The small routine of a man preparing for nothing more than sleep, then suddenly interrupted. Perhaps by the knock of the young man, perhaps by words exchanged too quickly. He could almost hear the voices, low, strained, punctuated by silences more telling than speech. He could feel the moment when something shifted, when one man remained and the other left, coatless, unprepared, but resolute. When he descended the stairs again, the younger inspector was waiting, eager for direction. He pressed Maigret for action, suggesting they bring Lemoine in formally, that they confront him with questions he could not avoid. Maigret only grunted. To press too soon was to close doors rather than open them. People broke not under interrogation, but under the weight of their own secrets. Lemoine was already breaking. Better to let him. That evening Maigret chose not to return to the Canal Café, but instead positioned himself near the boarding house where the woman had disappeared. He stood across the street, his bulk blending into the shadows, the pipe smoke curling in the damp night air. The building was modest, with a worn facade and shutters that rattled faintly in the wind. He waited, patient as always. After some time the door opened and the woman emerged. She wore the same scarf, the same dark gloves. Her steps were deliberate, not hurried as she made her way down the street. Maigret followed at a distance, steady, unhurried, never losing her silhouette against the lamplight. She walked across several streets, into quieter quarters until she reached a small church. She entered without hesitation. Maigret paused outside, watching the glow of candles within. After a long while she emerged again, her face composed but her eyes shadowed. She walked back the way she had come, unaware of the inspector's gaze. He did not follow her further. Instead, he stood for several minutes in the rain, considering. A woman who waited in cafes, who asked at a concierge's desk, who entered a church to sit with her thoughts. Such a woman was tied not to crime but to a man, bound by something deeper, perhaps guilt, perhaps love. The following morning he returned to the office. The reports were on his desk again. Lemoine had not slept. Lights in his apartment had burned until dawn. He had paced, smoked, written letters only to tear them up. His nerves were unraveling visibly. Maigret read this without surprise. The time was coming when the young man would no longer be able to bear the weight of silence. In the afternoon, Maigret went himself to the café near the canal. He sat at the back, beer before him, and waited. He did not wait long. Lemoine entered, his face pale, his eyes darting. He ordered wine, sat at a corner table, but could not remain still. His fingers drummed, his cigarette trembled. When he finally lifted his eyes and saw Maigret, his expression froze. Maigret did not move, did not beckon. He simply smoked, his presence filling the room. The silence stretched until Lemoine could bear it no longer. He rose, approached, and stammered that he had not expected to see the inspector there. Maigret only nodded, motioned for him to sit. Lemoine did, fumbling with his glass. Words tumbled from him. Denials, explanations, contradictions. He insisted again that he had only been Mercier's friend, that he knew nothing of his disappearance, that the woman was only an acquaintance. His voice rose slightly, too loud for the quiet café. Maigret did not interrupt. He let the young man talk himself into knots, his nervousness tightening with each repetition. At last, Lemoine's voice faltered, and he dropped his eyes to the table. Maigret asked only one question, spoken softly. Why had Mercier left without his coat? Lemoine looked up sharply, lips parting, but no words came. His throat worked as if he might speak, then closed again. His hands trembled against the glass. He muttered something about haste, about an urgent errand, but the words carried no weight. He fell silent, staring at the beer stains on the table as though they held the answer. Maigret finished his own beer, set the glass down carefully, and rose. He left without another word. Lemoine remained at the table staring, his face pale as chalk. Outside, Maigret pulled on his coat, lit his pipe, and let the drizzle settle on his hat brim. The young man was unraveling. It would not be long now. The truth, fragile as a candle flame, was flickering close. The drizzle returned before dawn, a thin veil over the rooftops that blurred the chimneys into shadows. Maigret rose heavily from his bed, careful not to disturb Madame Maigret, and dressed without hurry. The city was quiet, its streets washed clean but glistening, and he felt the familiar weight of a case that had not yet revealed its core. At Quai des Orfèvres, he found another report waiting on his desk, the handwriting of the surveillance men neat, precise, betraying their effort to impress him. Lemoine had spent the night pacing again, smoking ceaselessly, curtains drawn, no visitors. His nerves, they noted, were near collapse. Maigret sat back, filling his pipe. He imagined the young man in his chair, shadows stretching across his walls, unable to rest. That kind of silence eroded a man faster than questioning. He knew it well. Lemoine was crumbling in solitude, and it was only a matter of time before he reached for someone else to share the weight. Maigret puffed quietly, letting the thought settle. By mid-morning he returned to the boarding house where the woman had disappeared 2 nights before. The street was narrow, quieter than most, the shutters pale with peeling paint. He did not enter immediately. Instead, he stood across the way, pipe in hand, watching. People passed without noticing him, umbrellas angled low. At last the door opened, and the woman emerged. She was dressed in the same dark scarf and gloves, her posture steady, her pace measured. She did not look around her, but walked directly toward the market street nearby. Maigret followed at a distance. She moved among the stalls with deliberate calm, purchasing bread, a bit of cheese, some vegetables. She spoke little, only nodding to the vendors. Her manner was practiced, unobtrusive, as if she had spent years learning how not to be noticed. Yet Maigret noticed everything, the precision with which she counted coins, the way her eyes lingered a moment too long at a flower stall before she turned away, the faint weariness in her shoulders. She carried her parcels back toward the boarding house, and Maigret let her go without approach. He preferred her to remain undisturbed, unaware that she was observed. That afternoon he returned to Rue des Trois Frères. The tenants eyed him with thinly veiled curiosity as he climbed the stairs. In Mercier's room nothing had changed. The coat still hung, the spectacles still lay across the folded newspaper, the stub of candle hardened in its dish. Yet the silence felt altered, as though the air itself held expectation. He sat again on the edge of the bed, pipe unlit, staring at the objects. He thought of the woman, her careful movements, her silence. He thought of Lemoine, his fraying composure. Between them lay Mercier, unseen, absent, the axis on which both their lives seemed to turn. The younger inspector arrived breathless, carrying a new report. The letter Lemoine had posted earlier in the week had been intercepted. It was addressed not by name but to a post office box. The contents were short, hurried. "It is becoming impossible. He has not returned. They are watching me. What am I to do?" Maigret read it slowly, twice, before setting it down. The words betrayed fear more than guilt, a man pleading for guidance rather than concealing a crime. He asked where the box was located. The inspector gave the address not far from the canal. That evening, instead of returning home, Maigret went himself to the post office. He waited in the dim interior until the clerk, tired and indifferent, confirmed the box. It had not been emptied that day. He left instructions for vigilance, to note carefully who came for it but not to interfere. He left, the drizzle dampening his coat once more, and walked toward the canal with his pipe clenched between his teeth. The cafe was lively that night, filled with smoke and low voices. Maigret entered, his presence settling the air as it always did. He chose a corner, ordered beer, and waited. Lemoine arrived not long after, pale, restless, his eyes darting. He chose a seat near the back, ordered wine, and sat as if the chair itself were uneasy beneath him. Maigret did not move. He only watched, heavy-lidded, while the young man smoked and drank too quickly. After half an hour, Lemoine left. His steps hurried. Maigret followed at a distance through the wet streets. The young man walked quickly, his shoulders hunched, turning often as though fearing pursuit. At last he stopped at the building of the boarding house. He looked up at the windows, hesitated, then entered. Maigret remained outside, leaning against a lamp-post, pipe smoke mingling with the mist. He could almost feel the air within, the tension of voices exchanged in whispers, the weight of fear pressing between them. He did not intrude. He waited until the light in one window extinguished, then turned away. The pattern was clear enough now. Lemoine and the woman bound together by Mercier's absence, circling each other in secrecy, neither able to withstand the silence alone. The question was not whether they knew what had happened to Mercier, but which of them would bear the collapse first. The following morning, Maigret returned to the office. The intercepted letter lay on his desk, its words stark in his mind. He thought again of Madame Maigret's remark. A man who leaves his coat behind does not mean to return. He turned this over in silence, staring at the window where rain traced its endless path down the glass. By noon another report arrived. The woman had gone to the church again, sitting for nearly an hour before leaving with her head bowed. Lemoine, meanwhile, had not emerged from his apartment. He had drawn curtains, shut out the world. The silence was closing around him, pressing in. Maigret tamped his pipe, struck a match, and leaned back. The time was near when one of them would speak. It needed only patience. That evening he returned to Rue des Trois Frères once more. The concierge, anxious, confided that she had seen a shadow on the stairs in the night, though she could not say whose. She feared someone had entered Mercier's room. Maigret climbed slowly, each step echoing in the narrow stairwell. The door stood as it had, but when he entered he smelled the faint trace of tobacco not his own. Someone had been there briefly, leaving nothing but the smoke of a hurried cigarette. He sat on the bed again, pipe unlit, and stared at the coat. It hung heavier now, as though waiting for someone to claim it. Outside, the rain thickened, steady, unyielding. Maigret returned to the café, beer before him, eyes fixed on the doorway across the street. The case was not yet resolved, but the circle was tightening. The candle had burned down long ago, yet its flame lingered in memory, casting its quiet light over every gesture, every silence, every fear. He knew the truth was near, fragile, waiting for the moment when silence broke of its own accord. He could wait. He always waited. He always waited. The following day broke with a dull sky, the kind of morning when Paris seemed reluctant to rise. Maigret arrived at the office later than usual, his shoulders heavy under the damp weight of his coat. The reports awaited him, carefully typed, carrying the smell of ink and paper. He read them slowly, pipe in hand, while outside the rain traced uneven lines down the window pane. Lemoine had remained shut in most of the day before, curtains drawn, pacing like a prisoner. The woman, however, had left her boarding house in the afternoon. She had walked to the same church, sat in silence, and afterward gone to the market, her purchases modest, her manner subdued. The surveillance men noted that she looked around her only once, briefly, as if fearing she was followed. Maigret let the smoke curl around him as he considered the two figures. Lemoine, restless, gnawed by something unspoken. The woman calm but marked by resignation, her silence heavy with endurance. Between them lay Mercier, whose absence grew more palpable with each passing day, as though the space he had left behind was swelling rather than shrinking. Maigret tapped ash into the tray, leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. The truth was near. He could sense it pressing at the edges, but it had not yet chosen to reveal itself. By mid-morning he was once more in Rue des Trois Frères. The concierge met him at the door, her voice hushed. She whispered that there had been noises again in the night, faint footsteps on the stairs, though she had not dared leave her room to see. Her fear seemed genuine, yet tinged with the satisfaction of being witness to something unusual. Maigret grunted softly, climbed the stairs, and entered Mercier's room. The coat still hung on the chair, the spectacles still rested on the newspaper, but the faint odor of stale smoke lingered again. not his own pipe tobacco, but the sharper tang of hurried cigarettes. Someone had been here in the night, someone drawn to the emptiness of the room as if unable to resist it. He sat heavily on the bed, pipe unlit, staring at the stub of candle. It had burned itself out, yet in his mind the flame still wavered, illuminating the scene where one life had slipped into absence. He thought of Madame Maigret's words, "A man who leaves his coat does not mean to return." He thought of the intercepted letter, of Lemoine's pallor, of the woman's silence in church. Slowly he rose, walked to the chair and touched the coat. The fabric was heavier than he remembered, faintly damp still in the folds, though the days had passed. He frowned, said nothing, and left the room without disturbing anything further. That afternoon he went to the café near the canal. The air inside was thick with smoke and the smell of beer. He chose a table at the back, ordered his glass and waited. The hours passed slowly, but Maigret was a man who could wait as long as necessary. At last the door opened and Lemoine entered. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. He sat alone, ordered wine, but drank it in small sips, as though his stomach resisted it. His hands trembled faintly when he reached for his cigarette. Maigret did not move, did not call him over. His presence was enough. After several minutes, Lemoine's gaze fell upon him, froze, then darted away. The young man shifted in his seat, restless, unable to bear the silence pressing upon him. At last he rose, glass unfinished, and approached. He asked if he might sit. Maigret gestured with a slow nod, his expression unreadable. Words tumbled out at once, hurried, contradictory. Lemoine insisted again he had no part in Mercier's disappearance, that he knew nothing of the woman beyond casual acquaintance. His voice rose, then faltered, then rose again. He leaned forward, his face pale, his eyes desperate. Maigret did not interrupt. He puffed at his pipe, exhaled smoke, and listened, his silence a mirror in which the young man's words tangled upon themselves. At last, Lemoine's voice broke. He whispered that Mercier had been troubled, that he had spoken of leaving, of being watched. He claimed he had tried to dissuade him, but Mercier had been restless, almost frantic. The candle had been burning, he said, because Mercier had been waiting for someone. When pressed on who, his eyes darted away, his mouth closing. He muttered that he did not know, but the hesitation betrayed him. Maigret leaned back, said nothing, only let the silence hang. Lemoine lowered his head, his hands twisting together. Then, with sudden intensity, he asked whether the inspector believed Mercier dead. The words slipped out before he could stop them, hanging between them like smoke. Maigret drew slowly on his pipe, eyes heavy-lidded, and gave no answer. The silence itself was answer enough. Lemoine's shoulders sagged, his face crumpled, and for a moment he seemed on the verge of tears. He rose abruptly, muttered an excuse, and left the café in haste, his steps echoing against the wet cobbles outside. Maigret remained, drinking his beer slowly, letting the smoke curl upward. He knew the collapse was near. Lemoine was too tightly wound, his lies too fragile. The truth would come soon, not through pressure but through the weight of silence he could no longer carry. That evening Maigret walked once more to the boarding house. The woman was there, returning from her errands, her scarf pulled tight against the rain. She glanced briefly at him as she passed, her eyes steady but shadowed. She did not speak, but her glance held a question or perhaps an acknowledgement. He watched her enter the building, then remained outside in the drizzle, pipe smoke rising around him. The city pressed close with its damp silence, the glow of lamps on wet stones, the faint sound of voices muffled behind shutters. He stayed until the lights in her window went dark, then turned back toward the river. The case was no nearer its official resolution, yet he felt the truth circling closer, tightening. Lemoine unraveling, the woman waiting, Mercier absent but present in every gesture, every silence. The candle that had burned down to wax had left its flame in them all. Maigret walked slowly through the rain, his shoulders bowed, his pipe embers glowing faintly in the night. He knew that soon the silence would break, and when it did, it would not be through questions, but through the human weight of secrets too heavy to bear. The next day began with a dull, heavy light, the kind that turned the river a flat grey and made the city feel suspended in time. Maigret walked slowly from his apartment to Quai des Orfèvres, his broad shoulders hunched beneath his coat, the pipe clamped between his teeth. He was in no hurry. Cases like this did not bend to haste. They unfolded when people faltered under the silence. He reached his office, removed his hat, and hung his coat carefully before settling into the chair that had grown to his shape. On his desk lay a fresh report. Lemoyne had left his flat at dawn, moving quickly, almost furtively, and gone again to the boarding house of the woman. He had remained there for an hour before leaving, his expression pale, his steps hurried. The men tailing him noted that his lips moved as if speaking to himself, and that he stopped once in the middle of the street, leaning against a wall as though the weight of his thoughts pressed him down. He had then returned to his apartment, where the curtains were drawn tight once more. The woman, by contrast, had gone to church as before, staying longer than usual. She had wept silently in a pew near the altar before departing. Maigret read these words without surprise. The collapse was near. He had seen it too many times before. The way silence ate at people. How ordinary men and women carried secrets only so long before they spilled of their own accord. He tamped the tobacco in his pipe and lit it, exhaling slowly as the smoke curled around him. He had no intention of summoning them yet. It was better to let them come to him, driven not by summons but by the need to unburden. By mid-morning he was back at Rue des Trois Frères. The concierge was waiting, her face tight with worry. She whispered that someone had been again in Mercier's room during the night. She had heard the door creak, faint steps, and the smell of smoke had reached her on the stairwell. She dared not look. Maigret climbed slowly, his heavy tread steady on the worn steps. The door was closed, but when he entered the air confirmed her account. The acrid scent of cigarettes lingered, sharp against the musty fabric of the coat. He walked to the chair, ran a hand along the sleeve. Someone had touched it. He stood in silence, the room pressing in around him, then left without a word. In the cafe across the street, he ordered his beer and waited, the glass sweating faintly in his hand. He watched the doorway, the steady drip of water from the eaves, the thin trickle of passers-by. Hours passed in quiet rhythm. Then, near midday, the door opened, and the woman entered. She paused as though to steady herself, then walked slowly toward his table. She asked if she might sit. He nodded, his face unreadable. She placed her gloved hands carefully on the table, one over the other. Her voice was low, hesitant. She said she had heard he was watching, that people had told her his presence lingered across the street. She asked not directly, but with a quiet resignation, whether Mercier was dead. Maigret did not answer at once. He let the silence stretch, the weight of her question hanging between them. At last he said softly that he did not know yet, but that Mercier had left without his coat, and such a thing was not ordinary. Her eyes closed briefly, her breath unsteady. She confessed then in halting words that Mercier had been her companion for some months, not her husband but something close, a man she had waited for in quiet places, a man who had spoken of leaving but had promised to return. She said she had come to the boarding house because she could not bear to sit in her own rooms, because she needed to be close to the memory of him. Her voice trembled, but she did not weep. She spoke of Mercier as a man restless, troubled, fearing something unnamed. She did not know what. Maigret listened, pipe smoke curling slowly upward. He asked gently whether she knew Lemoyne. She hesitated, then admitted he was Mercier's friend, though she distrusted him. He was too eager, too insistent, always pressing Mercier for meetings, always appearing uninvited. She said Mercier had grown wary of him, yet never sent him away. She did not know why. She lowered her eyes then, her silence heavy with something unspoken. Maigret did not press. He let her sit in that silence, watching the way her hands gripped each other, the way her breath steadied with effort. At last she rose, murmured that she had said too much and left quickly, her scarf pulled tight against the rain. He watched her go without following. She had given him enough for now. That evening the city pressed closer, the drizzle heavier. Maigret returned to the café near the canal. The room was crowded with smoke and voices, but he chose his corner and waited. Lemoyne entered late, his face grey, his movements jerky. He ordered wine, drank it too quickly, and stared at the door as though expecting someone. When he saw Maigret, his expression collapsed. He approached, sat without being asked, and began to speak at once. He said Mercier had been frightened, convinced he was being followed. He said he had tried to help him, but Mercier had become distant, restless, no longer himself. He muttered that the woman was part of it, that she held Mercier in a grip he could not break. His voice grew bitter, then broke again into desperation. He said Mercier had left that night without a word, leaving everything behind. He did not know why. He swore it. Maigret smoked in silence, watching him. The young man's hands shook, his eyes darted. At last, in a low whisper, he said he feared Mercier was dead. He pressed his palms to his face, trembling, and for the first time tears slid through his fingers. His shoulders shook with the effort of restraint, but the collapse was real. The café grew quiet around them, the other patrons glancing over uneasily before returning to their drinks. Maigret let the silence envelop them both. He did not speak, did not offer comfort. He waited until Lemoine lowered his hands, his face ashen, his eyes hollow. The young man muttered that he had not killed him, that he could never, but that something had happened, something he could not name. He begged Maigret to believe him. The inspector finished his beer, set the glass down carefully, and rose. He left without a word, his heavy tread slow, deliberate. Outside the rain had thickened, glistening under the lamps, washing the cobblestones clean. He lit his pipe, drew deeply, and let the smoke drift upward. The truth was almost within reach. Lemoine was breaking. The woman's silence was cracking. Mercier's absence pressed on them both, shaping their every word, their every gesture. Soon one of them would give voice to the hidden truth, unable to bear the weight of silence any longer. Maigret walked on through the rain, his shoulders hunched, his face set in quiet contemplation. The city breathed around him, indifferent, eternal. Somewhere in a room still holding the smell of damp wool and extinguished candles, the answer waited. He would not chase it. He would wait, as he always did, until the truth stepped quietly into the open, unable to remain hidden. The rain had finally broken by the time Maigret walked once more to Rue des Trois Frères. The sky was pale, washed clean, though the street still glistened from days of drizzle. He moved slowly, his large frame steady, his pipe smoke trailing behind him. The city was quieter, as if holding its breath. He knew without hurry that the silence was ready to break. The concierge greeted him anxiously, whispering that the woman had come again in the night. She had not gone upstairs, but had lingered at the stairwell, her face pale, her eyes fixed on Mercier's door. Maigret nodded, his gaze heavy but calm. He climbed the steps, entered the room once more. The coat still hung, the spectacles still rested on the newspaper, the stub of candle hardened long ago. Yet the air seemed different, expectant. He sat on the bed, pipe unlit, and waited. It was late morning when the door opened quietly. The woman entered, her scarf pulled tightly, her eyes shadowed. She started at the sight of him, then stood very still, her gloved hands trembling. At last she said, almost in a whisper, that she could not carry it alone any more. Her voice was low, steady, but frayed at the edges. She spoke of Mercier, of his fear, of the way he had whispered that he must leave, that he could not stay another night. She said she had begged him not to go, but he had gone anyway without his coat, leaving behind what tied him to the life he wished to abandon. She had not seen him again. Maigret listened in silence, the weight of her words filling the room. He asked only one question, whether she believed he had meant to return. She shook her head, eyes closing. No, he had left for good. But she did not know where. Perhaps the river, she whispered. He had spoken of it once, late at night, when despair had weighed too heavily. Her voice faltered, but no tears came. She had carried it too long for tears. Before he could respond, there were footsteps on the stairs, hurried, uneven. Lemoine appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide. He froze at the sight of them, then pressed forward, his words tumbling. He said it was not his fault, that he had only tried to help, that Mercier had been desperate, that he had gone into the night saying he would never return. He insisted he had come back only to see if there was a letter, a sign. His voice cracked. His body sagged as though the effort of holding the secret had broken him. The woman turned to him, her face hollow, and for the first time her composure broke. She accused him softly of pressing Mercier too hard, of never leaving him peace. Lemoine shook his head wildly, tears on his face, saying he had loved him as a brother, that he had not meant to drive him away. The words filled the room, jagged, incomplete, overlapping. Maigret rose at last, his presence steady, quieting them both. He said nothing of blame, nothing of crime. He only said that Mercier had chosen his absence, that the candle had burned because he had not meant to return. The coat, the spectacles, the newspaper, these were the remnants of a man who wished to shed himself like an old skin. Neither of them had killed him. It was loneliness, fear, despair, ordinary human frailties that had done so. The woman wept then, silently, her hands covering her face. Lemoine slumped into the chair, shaking. The room filled with the weight of truth, not shouted, not proved, but lived. Maigret did not press further. He knew enough. Mercier would not return. Whether the river had claimed him or another road had swallowed him, he had gone with the same silence that filled the room now. Later, as the day waned, Maigret sat once more at the café across the street. The beer was cool, the foam thick, the glass steady in his hand. He watched the building, its door opening and closing as life resumed. The case would close quietly, filed among the many that ended not with an arrest but with a silence understood. The truth had been spoken in fragments, enough to see the shape of the absence. He sat back, pipe smoke curling into the pale evening air. Paris breathed around him, indifferent, eternal. Somewhere the river moved on, carrying what it carried. Somewhere the woman would sit in her church again, whispering prayers for a man who had slipped away. Somewhere Lemoine would pace his rooms, crushed not by guilt of crime but by the guilt of love unspoken, of a friendship too fragile. Maigret finished his beer, rose heavily, and walked into the dusk. He felt the weight of the case not as a burden, but as a familiar presence, the quiet recognition of human weakness, of lives entangled by longing and fear. The candle had burned down long ago, yet its flame lingered in memory, a reminder of how fragile people were, how easily silence consumed them. He turned toward home, where Madame Maigret would be waiting with supper, her calm presence ready to anchor him again. Behind him, Rue des Trois Frères sank back into its ordinary rhythm. The mystery was over, though no one would speak of it in those words. For Maigret, the end was not in revelation, but in understanding. And in that he was content.